December 1950. MacArthur, who promised his soldiers would be home by Christmas, is instead ordering the longest fighting retreat in American military history. American forces are fleeing south through frozen Korean mountains, abandoning equipment, fighting desperate rearguard actions, struggling just to survive. In Beijing, Mao Zedong receives reports of American collapse, and what he says reveals not celebration but cold recognition that this moment defines whether Chinese intervention succeeds or fails. The retreat proves Chinese forces can defeat American military power. But Mao understands that how China manages this victory will determine whether it leads to Chinese security or to American escalation that could destroy everything Chinese intervention was meant to achieve. What Mao says as MacArthur orders retreat shapes Chinese strategy for managing triumph without triggering catastrophe. Subscribe for more MacArthur stories and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. The American retreat that begins in late November 1950 is direct result of strategic trap Mao authorized and that General Peng Dehuai executed with devastating effectiveness. Chinese forces, infiltrated undetected into North Korea over weeks, launch coordinated attacks that catch MacArthur's overextended forces completely unprepared. Within days, units that were racing north toward victory are fighting for survival. The 8th Army in Western Korea begins retreat that will take it back below the 38th parallel. Marines at Chosin Reservoir are surrounded and must fight their way to the coast. The confident advance MacArthur promised would end the war has become desperate flight from enemy MacArthur swore would not intervene. What Mao says when he receives initial reports reveals satisfaction that Chinese strategy has worked as planned, but also immediate concern about what comes next. The tactical success is undeniable. American forces are retreating, suffering heavy casualties, abandoning positions that took months to capture. Chinese intervention has achieved its immediate objective of pushing American forces away from Chinese border. But Mao recognizes that retreat creates dangerous moment. MacArthur, humiliated by defeat he did not expect, will advocate for escalation to salvage victory. Washington, shocked by reversal, might authorize expanded war that Chinese strategy was designed to avoid. The retreat proves Chinese military capability, but creates political crisis that could spiral beyond Chinese control. The scale of American retreat exceeds what Mao expected or planned for. Chinese forces anticipated pushing American troops back from Yalu River, but did not expect complete collapse of MacArthur's position in North Korea. The retreat is not orderly withdrawal to prepared positions, but desperate flight accompanied by panic and disorganization. Mao must decide whether to order Chinese forces to pursue aggressively, potentially driving American forces completely off Korean peninsula, or whether to allow retreat while maintaining pressure but avoiding actions that might trigger American escalation. The decision balances military opportunities against strategic risks. What Mao tells Peng Dehuai reveals his strategic calculation about managing victory. Chinese forces should maintain pressure on retreating Americans, inflicting casualties and preventing them from establishing solid defensive positions too quickly. But Chinese forces should not attempt to encircle and destroy major American units, which would create crisis that might justify nuclear response MacArthur is advocating. The goal is to demonstrate Chinese capability while leaving Americans' path to retreat and eventually accept stalemate. This requires discipline to not pursue tactical opportunities that create strategic disasters. If you're seeing how Mao's restraint shaped the war's outcome, subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Mao receives detailed intelligence about MacArthur's response to the retreat his forces are conducting. Reports indicate MacArthur is requesting massive reinforcements, advocating for bombing Chinese territory, suggesting nuclear weapons might be necessary. More telling are intercepts showing tension between MacArthur and Washington, with Truman administration resisting escalations MacArthur demands. Mao understands that MacArthur's humiliation makes him dangerous advocate for expanded war, but also makes his position politically vulnerable. The challenge is ensuring his vulnerability leads to his removal, rather than to authorization of escalations he wants. What Mao says about MacArthur's psychology reveals sophisticated understanding of how pride drives strategic decisions. MacArthur cannot accept that his assessment was wrong, that Chinese intervention occurred despite his certainty it would not, that his strategy of advancing to Yalu River created disaster. Rather than acknowledging errors, MacArthur blames political restrictions and advocates for removing those restrictions through escalation. Mao recognizes this as pattern of leader who would rather risk catastrophe than admit failure. which makes MacArthur simultaneously less dangerous militarily and more dangerous politically. The intelligence Mao receives about American domestic reaction to retreat provides crucial information for Chinese strategic planning. Reports indicate American public is shocked by reversal from promised victory to desperate retreat. Some Americans support MacArthur's calls for escalation, but others question whether limited war in Korea serves American interests. Mao calculates that if Chinese forces create military stalemate rather than pursuing total American defeat, the voices questioning war might prevail over voices demanding escalation. Chinese restraint in victory can shape American domestic debate in ways that serve Chinese strategic interests. What makes American retreat significant for Mao is not just military success, but demonstration that American power has limits. For decades, Western powers dominated Asia through superior technology and firepower. Chinese intervention in Korea proves that determined Asian forces willing to accept casualties can fight Western military to stalemate despite material disadvantages. This psychological impact matters as much as tactical victories. The retreat MacArthur orders becomes symbol throughout Asia that Western military superiority is not decisive when facing revolutionary forces prepared to sacrifice for their objectives. Mao's most important strategic decision during American retreat is imposing limits on Chinese military operations despite tactical opportunities for greater success. Chinese forces have momentum. American forces are disorganized and vulnerable. Military logic suggests pursuing aggressively to maximize damage and potentially drive Americans off peninsula entirely. But Mao orders restraint based on strategic calculation that limited victory serves Chinese interests better than ambitious campaigns risking American escalation. What Mao says to justify restraint reveals his understanding that in revolutionary warfare, knowing when to stop is as important as knowing when to attack. Chinese intervention achieved its essential objective of preventing American conquest of North Korea. Pursuing retreating Americans too aggressively risks several dangers. First, it extends Chinese supply lines, while American supply lines shorten, reversing tactical advantages Chinese forces currently enjoy. Second, it creates impression that China seeks conquest of South Korea, which could unite American domestic opinion behind escalation. Third, it risks destroying major American units in ways that would humiliate American military so completely that political pressure for dramatic response becomes irresistible. The orders Mao approves for Chinese military operations reflect this strategic restraint. Chinese forces should maintain pressure, inflict steady casualties, prevent Americans from establishing strong defensive positions near 38th parallel. But Chinese forces should not attempt encirclement operations aimed at destroying entire American divisions. Chinese forces should avoid pursuing south of 38th parallel in strength, maintaining defensive character of intervention. These restrictions frustrate commanders who see opportunity for greater tactical success. But Mao's strategic vision prioritizes consolidating gains over pursuing ambitious objectives that risk strategic disaster. What Mao understands about American retreat is that it creates opportunity for eventual negotiated settlement, but only if managed carefully. Military stalemate, where neither side can achieve decisive victory, creates conditions for armistice. But stalemate must be constructed deliberately through operations that achieve limited objectives, while avoiding provocations that prevent political settlement. The retreat MacArthur orders gives China military success it needs to claim victory. Chinese restraint in exploiting that success creates space for eventual diplomatic resolution that serves Chinese security interests without requiring total defeat of American forces that would be politically unacceptable to Washington. Mao recognizes that American retreat creates moment when clear communication about Chinese intentions becomes essential. Washington needs to understand that Chinese intervention was defensive response to American approach to Chinese border, not first step in campaign to conquer South Korea. If American leadership believes Chinese forces intend to drive them off peninsula entirely, pressure for escalation becomes overwhelming. But if Washington understands that Chinese objectives are limited and that stalemate is acceptable outcome, voices advocating restraint might prevail over MacArthur's calls for expanded war. What Mao says about communicating with Washington reveals careful calibration between demonstrating Chinese capability and avoiding threats that would justify escalation. Through diplomatic channels and through public statements, Chinese government emphasizes that intervention was defensive, that China has no ambition to occupy South Korea, that China is prepared to negotiate once American forces withdraw from North Korean territory near Chinese border. These messages are designed to give Washington political cover to accept stalemate, rather than feeling compelled to escalate in response to humiliating defeat. The challenge is that American domestic politics and MacArthur's advocacy make it difficult for Washington to accept messages about Chinese intentions at face value. Many Americans view any communist statement as propaganda, regardless of accuracy. MacArthur is arguing that Chinese intervention proves aggressive intent and that only expanded war can secure American interests. Mao must communicate Chinese intentions through actions as well as words, demonstrating through restraint in military operations that Chinese objectives are genuinely limited. The retreat provides opportunity for this demonstration if Chinese forces pursue limited objectives rather than seeking total victory. What Mao understands is that MacArthur's removal from command would serve Chinese interests by eliminating most vocal advocate for escalation and by signaling Washington's acceptance of limited war. Reports indicate growing tension between MacArthur and Truman administration, suggesting MacArthur's position is vulnerable. Chinese strategy of creating stalemate rather than pursuing total American defeat helps undermine MacArthur's argument that only escalation can secure American interests. Every day that passes with Chinese forces maintaining pressure, but not attempting to destroy American forces, completely strengthens voices in Washington arguing for accepting stalemate over risking expanded war MacArthur wants. What Mao said when MacArthur ordered longest retreat in American history was vindicated by outcomes that followed. Chinese strategy of forcing retreat while avoiding actions that would justify American escalation achieved Chinese objectives while limiting risks. American forces withdrew from North Korean territory near Chinese border, eliminating immediate security threat. War eventually stabilized in stalemate near 38th parallel, exactly the outcome Chinese strategy sought. MacArthur was removed from command in April 1951, eliminating advocate for escalation. Armistice negotiations began, leading to settlement that preserved Chinese security interests while allowing America to maintain South Korea. The retreat marked a turning point not just in Korean War, but in Cold War competition between communist and capitalist powers. Chinese success in forcing American retreat demonstrated that revolutionary forces willing to accept costs could compete with Western military power despite technological disadvantages. This lesson influenced subsequent conflicts throughout Asia and elsewhere, as revolutionary movements recognized that Western military superiority was not decisive against determined opponents. The psychological impact of American retreat resonated through decolonization struggles and shaped how weaker powers approached conflicts with stronger adversaries. Mao's vindication came not from achieving total military victory, but from accomplishing limited objectives through careful strategy. Chinese intervention prevented American conquest of North Korea, established China as military power that must be respected, demonstrated Chinese willingness to defend security interests regardless of costs. These achievements came at terrible price in Chinese casualties, but Mao's calculation was that costs were justified by strategic gains. The restraint Mao imposed during American retreat proved as important as initial tactical success. Victory without catastrophic escalation required discipline to accept limited success rather than pursuing ambitious objectives that would have risked American nuclear response. What makes Mao's management of American retreat historically significant is demonstration that strategic wisdom sometimes means accepting limited victory when total victory risks transforming success into disaster. MacArthur's failure came from inability to accept limitations, from pursuing total victory that created conditions for catastrophic defeat. Mao succeeded by defining achievable objectives, executing strategy that accomplished those objectives, and imposing discipline to stop when objectives were achieved rather than pursuing tactical opportunities that would have created strategic disasters. The longest retreat in American history became vindication of Mao's strategic approach and demonstration that revolutionary warfare succeeds not through matching enemies' military power, but through better understanding of how to use limited power to achieve limited but essential objectives. Subscribe to see how strategic restraint proved more powerful than MacArthur's pursuit of total victory.